Hello, I wonder what you guys' feedback on this logo. See what you think. Voice it out. Thank you.
Anyway, tomorrow I'm wheels up, early morning, and back to the USA. Thank you very much. Let me first thank Junior Mateo for facilitating my visit here and for me to get a good look and an impression of how their racing operations going along. And the shop, as you can see here, a quick glimpse of very, how should I say, one of the state-of-the-art facilities here in the Philippine Islands. Dyno, flow bench. It is really very impressive, even for U.S. standards. Okay, so 3 floors, big, massive facility. They make their own mufflers, connecting rods, all that. But let me rehash some of the stuff that I will share with you, but I can't really give the particulars, all right? Because these guys are doing a lot of heads-up racing, so a lot of these are, information is very private to their operation, and I could not give out absolute numbers. But anyway, some I can give out. For example, when I get here, we're on the flow bench. I said, let's look at what kind of airspeed this thing gets. So, true to form, he ordered like what I asked for. We checked the airspeed on various parts of the intake port. And the amazing part is the roof of the port and the floor hit about 300 feet per second. 290 on the floor. Well, not really surprising, but when you look at this combination, it's a high port layout. All right, so the port angle, you can see the valve from a line of sight. That's what we look at, what we do for many years. The line of sight tells you it should be good flowing. And the higher the port is, there's not much curve as opposed to a medium riser port. We'll use the Ford description or Ford language we've used for many years. As far as the FE, we have the high riser, the medium riser, and of course the low port layout. We'll just say the high port heads from red speed flowed that much. Very impressive. But what I feel is that when you use that flow bench, and I've used it for many years, when I put a string, you see the air go through, it's pulling the string, real thin string, it dives into the short side, of course, because what's actually happening is that it's drawn in, all right, vacuum through the flow bench. The string will take the shortest path, so it dives to the short side. Therefore, a lot of people pay particular attention to the short side, but you can also be misled by that. All right, so some people go a little bit too much, modifying the short side to try to get their best numbers according to the flow bench. But in reality, the port speed is so fast it wants to straighten out and run into the long side wall because you have velocity, and it's not a flow bench per se, but it's a running engine condition. Now the flow bench is a constant pull. On a running engine, it's a stop and go. All right, the flow takes off when the intake valve closes. it stops. And then when it stops, it slams into the valve, the now closed valve, and that's what you call port recovery. Therefore, you can have two equal flowing heads, but one is a little bit more effective at recovering when the intake valve closes. That is what we see with this high port. The medium riser port, all right, I'm using Ford terminology here. The medium riser port, if I can find a picture of that here, it comes in, it has to go up a little bit on the source side and come down. What actually happens there is that it may flow the same like the high port, but it doesn't re-energize itself, or the port recovers. When the valve closes, it builds up, all right, stacks of flow on the closed intake valve. A low port doesn't have that ability, or quite as good an ability, to recharge itself or to pack flow right in the closed intake valve, so that next time it opens up, it shoves it all in. Okay, so the port speed might be the same as shown with this, but in reality, how fast it recovers is another factor. That's why you can have equal flowing ports or cylinder heads, but one just has an absolute advantage. Here, what they showed me is that the high port did flow the same as the medium port, or mid riser or medium riser, but horsepower on the dyno was significant. Cannot ignore it. It wasn't a small advantage. It was a big difference. All right, so that is where we come with that thing. Oh, also may I add, on the running engine, we would like to put an instrumentation where we can see if that holds true, how the floor speed or intake floor speed is the same on a running engine. And I tend to believe that it will go up where the port roof is, where the majority and the middle part would the majority flow would emanate from that area, and I bet you the airspeed will really pick up. Well, I hope it doesn't pick up anymore. That's really pretty fast. All right, so I would just like to know on a running engine if we can facilitate some kind of instrumentation and see what the actual airspeed is. Because the dyno does one thing, the racetrack also does another thing to the engine, dynamic-wise. And what I look at is if we can somehow put this instrumentation on a running engine and look at what actually happens as soon as the engine accelerates. They're turning 10,000 plus all the way to 12.5 where it cut off, and that is very impressive. Now I would like to know where the airflow goes at that fast speed, because according to my other videos that you guys seen, somehow the short side gets neglected. All right, most of the flow is on the top side of the port, and once it straighten out and hit the long side wall, all right, it's still going so fast. We just need confirmation and see where the airspeed is at. Also, 300 feet per second is what we got out of this on the flow bench. It's a big flow bench. Our machines isn't as big as that. Okay, so I really don't know if this 200 plus 250 cc engine or whatever they might require for their competition, if that's capable of generating that fast of a port speed. Because sometimes the limiting factor is the bore and stroke, how much lung capacity or displacement it has. That'll determine the airspeed. For example, if you have an oversized engine, the airspeed will be much faster on a somewhat restricted cylinder head. But if you have a lot of capacity, big CC runners, big ports, all right, it'll probably slow down. But on a large displacement engine, that airspeed will definitely pick up. Part of my experience here is that I've always said, we're talking NA here, that when you try to reduce the intake port flow in the exhaust, the crossover, right, where the column chart comes in and gets blown out the exhaust, and I told Junior, let's limit the exhaust flow and see what we can get, and we ended up with about 6% power gain. That to them was significant. All right, so there are other things that's just limiting the flow on the exhaust, but I've given him instructions or things to think about. What the next move is to further gain more cylinder head advancements or enhancements to give them a little bit more horsepower. And that was, they were very much surprised at what they saw, because sometimes the dyno, if it's a big advantage, will show up, not 0.5%, 1%, perhaps 3, 4, 5%. That's gain that you could pretty much repeat and evaluate, and when it shows, then you know that's hopefully it shows up at the racetrack. Also, another aspect is connecting rods. The factory's got a steel connecting rod. Red speed switched to aluminum, and I cautioned a little bit. I said, did you guys, the big end, you got the small end piston pin side, and that's not a concern really, but the big end of the connecting rod. I said, yes, they made the same diameter as the steel rod. Unfortunately, this can be misleading. If they're run, well, I asked, what engine temperature do you guys run? They go, what, about 185 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so let's check the connecting rod big end, what diameter it is. So remember, this is aluminum. It will expand more, open up more than a steel or a comparable steel equivalent. So they put in a, hot water 180. They check and they came back to me and they said, yeah, it's larger. All right, now here we go. Step 2. You use 185 because that's the engine temperature that you guys see on your motorcycle engine. But truth of the matter is, if the engine temperature is 180, the oil temperature is going to be probably 230, 240, 250. That is not surprising. Now, please put the same aluminum connecting rod on boiling water. Well, not really boil, it's close to already, if it's not pressurized. I go, put it about 245 degrees. So they did. And when it gets to that, let it soak a bit at 245. Take out the aluminum connecting rod and measure the big end again. So they did, and guess what? Their eyes opened up and they go, it's larger than when it was at operating temperature. I go, no, but this is the operating temperature. The oil temperature is even higher than the engine or cylinder head temperature or cooling system temperature. The oil is running at a much hotter condition. And you got to realize that you don't have any water jackets around that crankshaft, connecting rod bearing surfaces. You do have with a cylinder wall, but there's not really anything there to cool down the oil. It's just merely splash and circulation, keeps everything alive. That said, Junior and I looked at and we decided, all right, they'll make a titanium connecting rods, which they have some blocks. So back to the CNC machine, fashion a titanium connecting rod. Here we are. Now the connecting rod is finished. Let's put it up to the temperature again. It remained basically close to stock diameter. It didn't expand as much as aluminum, much closer to steel rod. So we'll stay with that. And then there are other things we changed on the connecting rod neck and the main body to try to cut down more weight. All in all, we can predict the quench of the piston to cylinder head more reliably and more consistently with a titanium rod instead of an aluminum rod, which has a tendency to stretch at high RPM. And a lot of this stretching happens not because of RPM per se, but when you get up to the high engine speeds, when the intake and exhaust valve is open, when you're in the overlap, the piston's going up, there's nothing holding it, like if you had a boosted turbo cylinder or turbo engine or supercharger, always have some kind of boost on that manifold, thereby right at the intake port there's something cushioning the connecting rod and the piston from slapping the cylinder head. Now, when you have an NA combination, intake valve opens up, all right, exhaust is already flowing, you have this overlap condition, piston's climbing up, and guess what? It wants to get excuse the expression, sucked into the combustion chamber, onto the cylinder head, and smack it, and that's when you stretch the rod. Okay, let's make that abundantly clear. That condition is what stretches the rod. Also, that's why when you over rev, you stretch the rod and you blow it up because you've lost control. All right. Remember, when the piston is coming down as well, it's trying to draw that column under. If you have some kind of ram induction tuning or whatever, it may help. But while it's drawing down, it's trying to pull that airspeed, that air column into the cylinder. Again, it's trying to pull the rod. All right, so that is just a fact of life with a 4-stroke cycle engine, and eventually all those conditions. That's why when I spoke to one of the main crank guys here on the West Coast, not that long ago, I told him my observations about the connecting rods stretching, especially when you start losing control of the valve train during the overlap phase. And I said the bottom part of the connecting rod gets hammered real good. And he goes, yeah, I noticed that. Now you explained it to me. It kind of drawn me, which I never thought about before, that it is stretching the rod. I said, yes, that's why the cap. And in fact, on the crank, this is the compression side, this is the coast side, all right? When it's going up, and it's got a lot of wear on the crank bearing on the bottom, opposite of where the compression side is at. When the piston goes to TDC, it's the bottom was wore out, because that's when it's trying to pull down on it. And the piston's getting drawn out of the speeding exhaust and the fastly introduced intake air column. Now the piston starts to come down and try to draw that in. It even stretches the rod even more so. Perhaps a little bit less if you had some kind of port resonance, all right, where that column gets shoved in there, hopefully artificially produce some kind of boost, all right, not really boost like we think about, but a little bit of pressure that gets inside the cylinder, ram pressure from the column when the port recovered, when the intake valve is closed. Something to think about, guys. Let's look back at the and when these guys tear down after a dyno session, they tear down the engine. I'm just watching. I have no, and I learned this from my mentor. I don't go in there and show real quick, this is what you're gonna find. I looked at what they're doing, and I'm watching, and so they finally got the engine torn down, and I said, are you guys done? They go, yes. I said, did you guys see anything wrong? They go, no. This is a good lesson, all right? And I said to one of the guys, give me the head gasket. So he grabs the head gasket. He's gonna wipe it off before he gives it to me. Don't wipe it off. I was surprised. I said, I want to see the telltale sign, what we call witness marks on the chamber. If it's telling you anything on the head gasket, the head, or the deck of the block. So he reluctantly gives me the head gasket. I'm looking. I said, you see nothing wrong with this? It looks good, sir. I said, okay. Then I pointed some of the discoloration. And again, I looked at, give me the head the cylinder heads. He picks it up. He's gonna wipe it off. See, it's a habit. I said, don't give it to me untouched. Then I looked at and I showed, you guys think this is good? I said, here you go. Look at this. And I pointed telltale signs on the head. And they were stunned, but not quite really believing, because they've been doing this for years, but they never looked at it the way I'm looking at it. So I called Junar, of course. He's the owner, very, very sharp. And I said, look at this closely. When I first gave it to him, he didn't know what he was looking at. I said, look at these lines right here on this combustion chamber, on this head gasket. You see those? He goes, yes. Why is it not evident on the other side, on the seal side of the cylinder wall? Right here are these lines. Those are combustion coloring, escaping the seal of the head gasket where the armor is at. And he goes, oh gosh, I've never seen that before. I said, yeah, because you guys take your engine apart, you wipe it off with a rag, then you inspect it. You do want to do that. Even the piston, I don't want anybody wiping it off so I can look at the coloration after they cut clean on on a full pass at the finish line, or even the dyno, shut it off, and if it backfires, it colorizes the piston chamber. I can get a hint on what it is doing. So I showed that to Junior, and he was stunned. Now he's looking at things differently. And also, may I make a comment? I love Cometic head gasket. I think they're the best out there, but they have one absolute defect for a lot of guys. All right, it's color black. If you're blowing past the head gasket, if you don't watch the deck closely or the surface of the head, you'll completely miss it. When I used to run copper head gasket on my race car, I like the copper color. When I lift it up, I can see combustion, evidence of combustion leaking past the armor or where the o-ring is at, and it looks all right. I'll do a segment just on head gaskets coming up here, and what we're looking at is that he was stunned. All right, like I said, this head gasket for their engines are silver, thank God. The Cometic, as good as they are, they're black in color. If the guy doesn't look at the deck of the head or the deck of the block, they will miss it. All right, to me, I pulled the head gasket, I looked closely, I said, okay, here it is. All right, it's leaking right here. In fact, this video I'm gonna come up with, I have a guy that recently brought me his small block, and it's running good. He was very happy. And I took it out of the box before he left. I said, let's read it before you go. I pulled out the head and I said, do you see anything here? He said, it looks good, just like here. All right, like I told the guys from Red Speed, don't feel bad, I pointed this out. A big majority of engine builders miss this altogether, especially when these guys are running Cometic head gaskets, so forth and so on. That black gasket situation. Now, when I showed this guy back in the States his cylinder head, and I said, look at here, he couldn't believe it. He thought his head gasket was intact. So when I scratched off with a blade some of the evidence that I had on the deck of the head, I said, what is this? Is it the same one on your exhaust? That carbon buildup in your exhaust is right here on the head gasket. So what is this telling you? He goes, oh, you're right. But I was fast. I said, yeah, because you probably tuned better. But all that time, you're tuning better and better. Your engine's going backwards and backwards and backwards. All right, so I will highlight those things. That's a good lesson for all of us. Therefore, when I get back, that's the first thing on my agenda. All right, so they learned quite a bit. There are other things that I had to show. I can't really divulge it right now. Maybe when the bag is out of the, maybe when the cat is out of the bag, then I can just talk about it. But right now, Junior wants to have his advantage, and we'll give it that. All right, he paid for my way to get here, and I'm not about to just go out there and expose to everybody what he has learned, because he had the insight to bring me there and look at their engine program and their cylinder head, and that's where I come in and did my part. Now the cylinder head, a little bit, I've asked that he shorten the exhaust runner, because sometimes, in fact, most cylinder heads out there that we race, V8s in particular, if you notice, the intake ports are long, or longer than the exhaust port. And I said to him, this long exhaust port that you have here is going to be basically, it limits your capability to improve your combination, because it's too long. Maybe some engine configuration requires that you come out of your exhaust port and transition to a bigger diameter, all right, while the airspeed is fast, and increase it, I think it was like a D port, increase it to 1.5 inches to 1.75 to 7/8, whatever transition you want to do on your header primary pipe. When the port is too long, and you need to transition immediately after it comes out of the flange. But if the flange is double the length, or the flange is, instead of being here, then you transition to your primary pipe diameter that you think is just about right. Now it's this long. You can't transition right here because this casting is there permanent. So I told them, let's cut that down on the new casting. They make their own cylinder heads. I said, let's cut that down, and let's basically give you that option to transition to a smaller primary pipe if need be, or transition to a bigger. All right, because while the airspeed comes out of the exhaust port really super fast, it slows down big time. All right, as soon as it exits, because it starts to cool down, and when it cools down, it gets heavier, slows down, and that's what you start calling back pressure. You don't want that. In order for back pressure to be reduced, you have to go bigger on the diameter, give it space, all right, and hopefully keep it moving. And there are other tricks that we need to look into that I showed them. So that just like an intake port, when your intake port's too doggone long, for example, you have a high RPM engine, it doesn't want long intake ports. Torque producing engines, sure, long runners, long manifold, but when you're looking at a high RPM, you end up with a short manifold or a short runner, and then to the head ports. But if your head port's too long, all right, I don't care if you do that intake port on the manifold shorter than usual, it's still too long altogether. So if you make that intake port, cast it on the head about the right length, again, you have the flexibility and the tuning ability to shorten your runners and get results. But if the runner is way too long to start with, I don't care what you do with your fancy sheet metal intake or whatever intake you have, it's too long, all right? And pretty soon you're probably on the flange right at the head. That's where you bolt up your throttle body or carburetor. All right, so it applies the same way. Too long of an intake manifold runner, okay, or intake port runner, just like too long of an exhaust runner, could be a hindrance for power. All right, I just want to relay that out there. Also, the Quench here, when the engine was torn down, I could see some issues where the Quench is too tight. All right, the fuel, I mean, they're turning 12,000 RPM. The fuel flow is just slamming straight to the long side port, and probably the long side port right on the cylinder wall. Then the piston comes up and squeezes it, and I feel that from what I can see that the engine's hydraulic in itself while it's running, because the Quench can specify what it is, but it's too tight. All right, so they changed that. I don't want to give that away, what combination they run, but it's tight where when the piston comes up with the air fuel, or more like the fuel molecules, slam into the long side wall, and adjacent to this below the cylinder wall, it's all accumulated here, and the piston coming up, it hits the Quench side and jacks that head, which probably was the reason that I saw those blow-by gases, witness marks on the head gasket, because I think it was hydraulicing the cylinder at high RPM. And I said, let's look at that and let's go a little thicker and hopefully stay away from that issue or from that condition, because at that high RPM, I mean 12.5, 10,000 RPM, that's up there. And with the aluminum rod back then, that was even worse for them. So now we went titanium. Hopefully it did stretch and basically smack the head. But like Smokey Unix said before, you make the best power when the piston smacks the head a little bit. I mean, literally, it makes sense to us engine builders, but if it's smack, it's interference, yeah, you could jack up the cylinder and lose the head gasket or do some other damages. But what he meant was get the Quench very close. But also, let me make it clear out there, the Quench, especially on the intake side, since it's already lean, when it's tight, the flame front is expanding, all right, towards the hole, like a sphere, towards the hole. The intake is right here. When you have a Quench, it's already lean to start with, and the burn emanates here and going towards the center and to the edges. There's a temperature pressure spike right here, and then boom, auto ignition, secondaries. So you have to play with like the V group I showed, or when you soften the head, you put an angled quench, 460 degrees, maybe whatever needs to get done, to allow that speeding fuel front to really progress to the quench side, which is really isolated by a tight quench. That's how you allow it to go inside and flame up that area and consume those gases instead of having a temperature spike when it's too tight. The fuel front can't quite get in there. And the burn sequence starts like a sphere. It starts to propagate across the bore. But usually it's a little bit slower towards the intake valve area of the cylinder wall. Now, when it's doing that, it's propagating like any burn situation. It starts as it's not an explosion. Remember that, okay? A lot of people say, oh, the explosive ignition. No, it's a fast burn. And every time the fast burn is going across the bore, it has a tendency to speed up to an explosion. That's why we have a quench that kind of stops all that. And also does other situations. Some of these mixtures that are trapped on the quench are pushed towards the center of the cylinder, towards the spark plug area. So it gets pushes and it collides and mixes, and you have better burn sequence. Also, right here on the intake side, all right, there's the intake side or the intake valve. Once it starts to burn, it goes and hits the quench and starts to slow down. When it slows down, it basically stops going towards that very tight area. This way, if you put a quench with an angle, all right, the flame front starts to take off and propagates. It's like a ramp to go in there and burn those areas quickly. All right, so I'm exaggerating here. It's usually very tight with a little taper, and that sequence goes in there and burns that basically restricted area, and anything combustible burns, and then there's no detonation or secondary issues of ignition, automatic or auto ignition. All right, so you need to put that ramp in there so it allows it to propagate there, and it's not an open chamber, it just takes off to an explosion, but somewhat of a ramped up quench and lets it burn through easier. All right, so it doesn't have a temperature pressure spikes and auto ignites and therefore detonation.